December 1914. Imagine that. Not the December you know from history books sanitized for classroom consumption. Not the sanitized version where soldiers put down their guns and sang carols and everything was resolved peacefully. This was the December when the Western Front had been bleeding for 5 months. When 1 million men were already dead. When Christmas arrived in trenches that smelled like corpses and human waste and mud that had become liquid darkness. When soldiers discovered that the enemy was human. That the men trying to kill them weren't demons or monsters, but just teenagers who were cold and hungry and terrified exactly like them. When something shifted in the collective consciousness of European civilization and a moment of grace emerged from the worst war humanity had yet waged. The Christmas Truce of 1914 changed everything about how humans understand war and morality and the power of shared humanity to transcend the machinery of destruction. It proved something that military leaders never wanted proven, that soldiers didn't have to fight, that enemies could become brothers, that the hierarchies of war could be dismantled in a single moment through the simple act of recognizing another human being's humanity. And that recognition terrified military leadership so much that they never allowed it to happen again in any subsequent Christmas during the 4 years of trench warfare that followed. This is the story of the moment when European civilization glimpsed an alternative to mechanized mass death and then collectively chose to ignore it. Before we dive into what happened on December 24th and 25th, 1914, comment where you're watching from and what you know about World War I. Because what happened on Christmas during that war challenges everything we're taught about military necessity and enemy and the supposed inevitability of violence once war has begun. What happened suggests that war is maintained through active choice, through propaganda, through psychological manipulation that keeps soldiers hating enemies they've never met and fearing people who are actually terrified too. Comment your location. Tell me what you think would have happened if the Christmas truce had spread across the entire Western Front. Tell me what would have happened if soldiers in 1914 had collectively refused to fight. Tell me if you think that was possible or if military power would have crushed it immediately. Let's debate this because it matters for understanding how war works and whether war is inevitable or constructed. September 1914. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas was still killing hundreds of thousands. Nobody anticipated what trench warfare actually meant. The generals had planned for mobile warfare, for cavalry charges and strategy, and the kind of conflict that had characterized previous European wars. Instead, they got a stalemate where two armies faced each other across 250 miles of trenches from the English Channel to Switzerland. Trenches that were simultaneously warfare's most famous feature and its most psychologically devastating reality. You wake up in mud up to your ankles. You stand in mud for hours. You eat food that fell in mud. You look across no man's land at enemies in identical mud-covered trenches. You don't see their faces clearly because distance and darkness and fear create blur. You see shapes, other soldiers, vague threats, abstractions. The trenches were deliberately designed to create psychological distance between enemies. Distance that enabled soldiers to kill people they couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't understand as humans. Artillery bombardment worked partially because it killed from distance, from above, making the deaths seem impersonal. Machine guns worked because they transformed killing into a mechanical process where individual shooters couldn't individually comprehend what they were destroying. Poison gas worked because it killed invisible. The entire Western Front was engineered to enable mass death while minimizing soldiers' psychological confrontation with their own human capacity for killing. And it worked. For 5 months it worked. Then came Christmas. By December 1914, the soldiers had settled into a different kind of consciousness. The war hadn't ended by Christmas as promised. 5 months of trenches had transformed these men from civilians into something different. Some historians call it soldier consciousness. The awareness that you might die today. The acceptance that the next bombardment might be the one that kills you. The psychological adaptation that lets humans continue functioning when death is imminent and constant. But 5 months of bombardment and stalemate had also created something unexpected. Homesickness, exhaustion, and most dangerously, the recognition that the enemy wasn't actually trying to launch massive offensive operations. The front had stabilized into a kind of grinding mutual horror where both sides were waiting for something. Both sides understood that winter would make offensives nearly impossible. Both sides were exhausted. Both sides had stopped believing that military victory was imminent. Into this psychological space came Christmas. A Christmas in the trenches meant different things to different soldiers depending on their positions and units, and what supplies had arrived. Some trenches had received packages from home. Socks, tobacco, letters from families who seemed impossibly distant and almost fictional. Food that wasn't rations. Alcohol. Some trenches had received nothing except official notice that Christmas dinner would be a special meal provided by military logistics. The psychological importance of Christmas was complicated. For most soldiers, it represented connection to a world that seemed to have abandoned them. Christmas was the world before war. Christmas was home and family and peace and normalcy. Christmas was the antithesis of trenches. Celebrating Christmas in trenches meant attempting to resurrect normalcy in an environment explicitly designed to destroy it. Christmas meant acknowledging that life continued somewhere beyond the killing. Christmas meant believing you might survive to celebrate Christmas again someday. Christmas also meant profound despair because celebrating Christmas while standing in trenches made the contrast unbearable. Now here's the question I want you to answer. If you were commanding a unit of soldiers on December 24th, 1914, knowing that the front had stabilized and that major offensives were unlikely until spring, would you order soldiers to maintain constant vigilance and readiness? Would you initiate artillery barrages to maintain pressure on the enemy? Would you create opportunities for skirmishes and small-scale attacks? Or would you maintain the ceasefire that had actually developed along much of the Western Front? Would you use Christmas as justification for minimal activity? Or would you use military logic to argue that Christmas shouldn't affect war operations and therefore bombardment should continue? Your answer reveals something about how you understand military leadership and the balance between maintaining combat readiness and recognizing human limits. Comment below, because this is exactly what happened on December 23rd and 24th, 1914. Different sections of the front had different degrees of conflict and different levels of command. The Saxons in their trenches were relatively quiet. The British opposite them weren't particularly aggressive. The Irish regiments weren't launching attacks. Much of the front had achieved an informal ceasefire that was never explicitly negotiated, but had developed naturally through mutual exhaustion and recognition that neither side could decisively defeat the other, and therefore constant fighting was pointless. But other sections of the front remained active. German units in different areas continued bombardment. British units continued patrols. French units continued harassment. The Christmas Truce wasn't universal along the entire front. It was concentrated in specific areas where the soldiers and local commanders had reached unspoken agreement that mindless killing served no purpose during Christmas. It was concentrated where soldiers had actually developed enough mental space to recognize each other's humanity. The first documented evidence of truce came on December 23rd when Germans began placing Christmas trees in their trenches. Actual evergreen trees decorated with candles and simple ornaments, visible from the British trenches across no man's land. The symbolism was unmistakable. These are humans preparing for Christmas just like you are. The trees violated every military principle of concealment and protecting position. You don't decorate your trenches with anything that gives away position or morale or vulnerability. Yet the Germans deliberately displayed these trees. They hung them over the parapets where British soldiers could clearly see them. On December 24th, Germans began singing Christmas carols, Silent Night, Oh Come All Ye Faithful, songs in German that British soldiers didn't understand linguistically but understood emotionally because they recognized the melodies. Because these were the same songs being sung in British trenches across no man's land. On December 24th evening, British soldiers heard Germans singing Christmas carols and something in the collective consciousness shifted. The singing continued for hours. Germans singing on one side, British soldiers listening on the other, not shooting, not attacking, not maintaining vigilance against a military threat, just listening to enemies sing their way through Christmas Eve. By morning of December 25th, soldiers in multiple sections of the front began leaving trenches, leaving weapons behind, walking into no man's land, walking toward enemies who had been trying to kill them 5 days earlier. What happened next was documented in letters soldiers sent home. These letters weren't propaganda. They were personal correspondence that soldiers wrote expecting military censors to prevent them from reaching homes. Many did get censored. Some made it through. Historians have compiled them into the historical record that documents what actually occurred. A letter from a British soldier named Ernie Williams described crossing no man's land on Christmas Day 1914 and meeting Germans who were equally terrified and equally curious. They shook hands. They exchanged addresses. They shared food. They took photographs together. They helped each other bury bodies from previous days' fighting. They sang carols together in multiple languages. They were able to identify individual humans across the distance that war had created. Letters described German soldiers showing photographs of wives and children. British soldiers sharing tobacco. Shared recognition that they were both trapped in the same nightmare imposed by distant commanders. One letter describes a German soldier saying in broken English, "We not shoot you tomorrow. Tomorrow you not shoot us. Today we live." The psychological transformation was immediate and profound. Soldiers who had been psychologically prepared to shoot people suddenly had faces on those people, suddenly had names, suddenly had humanity. This is what military training tries to prevent. This is why warfare attempts to maintain psychological distance. This is why soldiers are taught to see enemies as abstractions rather than humans. But on Christmas 1914, the distance collapsed. Along significant portions of the Western Front, soldiers who had killed for months recognized that killing wasn't necessary, that they could coexist, that they could choose not to fight. And for a brief moment before military leadership reasserted control, this truth became visible. This possibility became real. The informal truces lasted anywhere from a few hours to several days depending on location and unit. In some areas, soldiers returned to their trenches after Christmas Day. In other areas, the unofficial ceasefire continued into December 26th and 27th before being forcibly ended by command orders. Officers began receiving reports that soldiers weren't maintaining vigilance, weren't firing on Germans who were visible in opposing trenches, weren't maintaining the psychological distance necessary for warfare. Officers began receiving orders from higher command to restore combat conditions. Officers began imposing discipline on soldiers who refused to shoot. One documented case describes a British officer threatening execution if soldiers didn't maintain fire against the Germans. The threat wasn't empty. Courts-martial and execution were the punishment for refusing orders during wartime. So soldiers returned to killing because refusing meant their own officers would execute them. The truce ended not because soldiers lost recognition of Germans' humanity, but because military hierarchy and force returned to mechanical killing. The Christmas Truce of 1914 ended because the machinery of war demanded its continuation. But something had shifted permanently in the consciousness of soldiers who participated in the truce. They had experienced an alternative. They had proven that soldiers could choose not to fight. They had recognized that warfare was maintained through coercion rather than necessity. They had discovered that enemies weren't actually enemies but just humans trapped in the same impossible situation. They knew that the officers commanding them were willing to execute soldiers who refused to fight. That realization changed everything. After December 1914, morale began deteriorating across the Western Front. Soldiers who had participated in truces spread word of what had happened. Soldiers understood that their officers would execute them before permitting genuine peace. Soldiers began understanding that the officers who wanted to continue fighting were actually their enemies more directly than the Germans across no man's land. Mutinies began occurring. Soldiers refused orders. Soldiers deliberately aimed high to avoid hitting targets. Soldiers sabotaged weapons and supplies. The Christmas Truce of 1914 wasn't crushed immediately, but it was impossible to suppress completely. The knowledge that peace was possible had spread through the trenches like psychological contagion that no amount of discipline could completely eliminate. Military leadership recognized the danger and moved systematically to prevent another Christmas truce in 1915. New soldiers were rotated in specifically to prevent any of the original truce participants from serving together again. Orders were issued explicitly forbidding any recognition of enemy humanity. Bombardments were scheduled specifically for Christmas to prevent soldiers from developing any psychological space for recognizing that enemies were human. Propaganda was intensified to reinforce hatred and dehumanization. Soldiers were taught that Christmas truce participants were traitors who had betrayed their country. Military discipline was tightened. Courts martial increased. Executions increased. Soldiers who refused to fight weren't uncommon in later war years. The Christmas Truce of 1914 had revealed something that military leaders spent the rest of the war trying to suppress: that soldiers would choose peace over war if given the psychological space to recognize enemy humanity. That the continuation of war depended on active suppression of empathy and recognition, and the deliberate maintenance of psychological distance between enemies. That warfare wasn't inevitable, but constructed through military leadership's deliberate choices. Here's what we need to understand about the Christmas truce that modern history sometimes obscures. This wasn't a spontaneous outbreak of peace that emerged from soldiers' inherent goodness. This was a deliberate choice by soldiers to recognize each other's humanity despite being trained to kill. This was an act of rebellion against military hierarchy that could get soldiers executed. This was resistance against the machinery of war. And military leadership moved systematically to crush it. The Christmas truces in 1915, 1916, 1917 didn't happen. They were prevented through explicit orders, through propaganda, through discipline, through the deliberate elimination of psychological space where soldiers might recognize enemy humanity. By 1918, soldiers were so carefully controlled that independent recognition of enemies' humanity became almost impossible. Soldiers who had witnessed Christmas 1914 knew that the war could have ended in 1914. They spent the next 4 years watching millions die for reasons that they recognized were maintenance of military power rather than national necessity. That knowledge drove the mutinies at war's end. That knowledge drove the revolution in Russia. That knowledge drove the unstable peace of 1918 to 1939 that eventually led to World War II. The Christmas Truce of 1914 wasn't a moment of peace that resolved the war. It was a moment of truth that revealed war's nature and terrified military leadership so much that they spent 4 years ensuring it couldn't be repeated. What happened to the soldiers who participated in the truce? Many were transferred or reassigned to breakup units where bonds had formed. Some were executed for subsequent refusals to fight. Some survived the war and spent the rest of their lives carrying the knowledge that peace had been possible and had been deliberately crushed. Many died in the grinding warfare of 1915 to 1918 that continued because military leadership refused to permit the peace that 1914 soldiers had proven was possible. The psychological impact persisted through surviving soldiers into the next generation. Some historians argue that the Christmas Truce's suppression contributed to the psychological damage that many World War I survivors carried. They had glimpsed peace. They had experienced enemy as human. They had recognized that the war could end. And they watched as military hierarchy deliberately prevented that ending. That trauma shaped the generation that came after. One final question before we finish this exploration of the moment when soldiers chose humanity over military orders. Comment truce if you made it through this entire video about war and peace and the possibility of choosing differently. And tell me what you think would have happened if the Christmas truce had spread across the entire Western Front. What if soldiers in all sectors had refused to fight on Christmas 1914? What if military discipline had been unable to suppress the movement toward peace? What if the machinery of war had broken down before 4 more years of fighting? Comment your answer plus truce so I can count responses. Let's crowdsource what might have been possible if soldiers had collectively resisted military leadership in December 1914. The lesson from the Christmas Truce of 1914 is this: war is choice. Military leaders choose to continue fighting. Officers choose to execute soldiers who refuse. Propaganda systems choose to dehumanize enemies. Soldiers choose to recognize enemy humanity or maintain psychological distance. The Christmas Truce proved that if soldiers chose recognition of humanity, warfare became impossible. That terrified military leadership so much that they spent 4 years ensuring it never happened again. But the knowledge persisted. The understanding that peace was possible persisted. And that understanding eventually contributed to the end of warfare, at least temporarily, even though military leadership tried to prevent that recognition. The Christmas Truce of 1914 changed everything about our understanding of war. It proved that warfare isn't inevitable, that soldiers can choose not to fight, that military leadership maintains warfare through coercion rather than necessity, that the machinery of war can be disrupted by simple human acts of recognition and connection, and that military power will move systematically to prevent any repetition of that disruption. The truce lasted hours or days in December 1914, but its implications lasted decades. Its psychological impact shaped an entire generation. Its revelation that peace was possible changed how humans understood the nature of warfare forever. The soldiers sang carols across no man's land on Christmas Eve 1914. They crossed trenches and shook hands on Christmas Day. They refused to shoot enemies who had suddenly become human. And for a moment, the machinery of European warfare stopped. For a moment, soldiers chose humanity over military orders. For a moment, peace was possible and real and existed between the trenches. Then military leadership reasserted control. Then coercion replaced choice. Then the killing resumed. But soldiers who participated in that moment carried the knowledge forward. That peace was possible. That enemies were human. That war was choice. That knowledge couldn't be completely suppressed despite 4 years of warfare and death and deliberate efforts to reinforce dehumanization. What would have happened if the Christmas Truce had been allowed to grow? If military leadership had recognized the soldiers' choice toward peace and permitted its continuation? If 1914 soldiers had collectively refused to return to fighting? The war would have ended in its first year. Millions would have lived who died. European civilization would have developed differently. The Russian Revolution might not have happened. World War II might not have happened. The 20th century might have taken a completely different trajectory. All of that hung in the balance during December 1914, when soldiers chose to recognize enemy humanity despite being trained to kill. All of that was crushed when military leadership reasserted control and forced soldiers back into mechanical killing. The Christmas Truce of 1914 wasn't just a moment of peace during war. It was the moment when human civilization could have chosen a different path and collectively decided to maintain warfare instead. That's what changed everything about the Christmas Truce. Not that soldiers briefly chose peace, but that military leadership moved systematically to ensure peace couldn't be chosen again. The truce proved that war was choice. That revelation terrified power structures so much that they transformed warfare itself to prevent soldiers from ever again recognizing enemy humanity. The trenches of World War I became something new after Christmas 1914. They became psychological machines designed specifically to prevent the kind of recognition that had occurred on Christmas Day. Military leadership learned the lesson that soldiers learned, that humans could choose not to fight. And military leadership spent decades developing systems to prevent that choice from emerging again. The Christmas Truce of 1914 changed everything about how warfare would be conducted in the 20th century. It proved that soldiers could choose peace. And it proved that military power would do anything necessary to prevent that choice from disrupting the machinery of war.